Morning, everybody, and welcome to the Free Market Foundation roadshow. I'd like to introduce to you the CEO, David Ansara, who will be speaking to you today, and Martin van Staden, the head of policy. And I know that you're going to enjoy what they have to say, and let's hope that we can all put this into practice. So welcome, guys, and I'm very excited that you're here.
Well, thank you very much, Colette. Great. Well, Colette introduced us very well, and thank you very much, Colette, for arranging this wonderful event. Very pleased to see so many people turning out on a Saturday morning. I'm sure you have lots of other things competing for your attention, so we really appreciate it. So, as Colette mentioned, we're from the Free Market Foundation. The FMF is a policy think tank, so we are a non-partisan organization. We're not explicitly involved in the political party process. We're a non-aligned organization, independent, but we're very interested in the policy landscape in South Africa and the broader political environment as well. And essentially our main purpose is to maximize the amount of human freedom in South Africa. So what does that mean specifically? That means a strong individual rights framework. Your ability to freely trade and interact with one another. It's called the Free Market Foundation. So we're capitalists at heart. We believe that people who are free to engage in commerce with one another and to trade goods and services, that really creates a lot of human prosperity. Private property rights is an essential foundational building block for a free society. So that's why historically we've been very opposed to any attempts to undermine private property rights, like expropriation without compensation. We're dead against that. And then also, very importantly, the rule of law and constitutional government. So our conception of the role of the state, of government, is a very limited one. So we want the government to be as small as possible, to enable people to make their own choices and to pursue their own ends in life. At the moment in South Africa, we have the opposite of that. We have an incredibly large, bloated state that has a very wide scope and involves itself in the private affairs of individuals and also in various aspects of economic activity. So the state is a very interfering state, not an enabling state. So we want government to be small. And one of the principles that we fundamentally believe in, and it's related to this idea of limited government, is that government should be decentralized, that you shouldn't have one central entity that basically dictates how people should live their lives in some faraway place like Pretoria or the legislative capital, Cape Town. We believe that communities in South Africa and different regions have very specific interests and needs and dynamics, social dynamics, different kinds of people, different languages, etc. These play out in different ways. And if you consider South Africa, it's a country, a vast country, it's twice the size of France. And the people who make decisions on your behalf, who sit in a very far away place in Pretoria, they enjoy enormous power and influence over the lives of ordinary citizens. So as I said, we have this over-centralization of power, and not only do we have that, but we have this very paradoxical state where we have the government is adopting more and more functions. It's involved in all of the various aspects of economic and private life in South Africa. So we have this extremely extensive regulatory framework. So that covers everything from your ability to hire and fire employees. We have very strong protections for workers, but that creates a disincentive to hire people. That drives unemployment. We have black economic empowerment, which is also highly restrictive and takes equity away from value-creating companies and gives it to politically connected elites who then use that for their own advantage. We have a very extensive industrial policy with lots of tariffs and subsidies and quotas, all of which adds to the bureaucratic burden of doing business and just conducting your ordinary affairs in South Africa. And so the paradox is that as the state tries to expand and extend its scope and its powers, its basic functions are collapsing. So what is the core role of the state? The core role of the state is to protect your rights, to uphold the rule of law, to administer the courts and the justice system, and to prevent criminality and people's rights being violated by other citizens, and to uphold private property rights and to enforce contracts. On all of those core measures, the state is failing. So we have a rampant crime problem in South Africa. The South African Police Service, the National Police, is essentially collapsing in on itself. And I'm sure there are many good policemen who want to ensure peace and stability in the country, but the political leadership, the fish rots from the head, as they say. That's where the big problem is. And there seems to be a clear lack of political will to really deal with that problem. We're involved in many projects which you'll hear about today, one of which is called the Section 12 Initiative, where we're trying to highlight the grave impact that crime is having on our country. And some of the statistics are very startling. We have about 86 murders per day in South Africa, 5 reported rapes per hour in South Africa. And those are only the reported incidents. So the trio crimes, robbery and assault, things like that, those numbers are also very high. And so that indicates to you that the state's core functions are breaking down. The state has also monopolized critical infrastructure provision. So ports and rail, most of that is controlled by the state, but that system is also under severe stress or is collapsing. So we have lots of blockages in the ports. Our rail system for getting goods and raw commodities around, from the mines, for example, or the factories to the ports, that system is no longer working. So we have this huge dependency on road freight now. And then, there's a long laundry list of areas where the state is failing. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, if you look at the energy situation, we often read about the boiler at Medupi exploding, or the conveyor belts having the low quality coal that goes into the furnace and then that destroys the furnace. You can see I'm not a very technical person, but chimney stacks falling over because it's the wrong specifications or whatever. All of those are engineering problems, but again, those problems are downstream from policy choices, and the policy choices are downstream from essentially a socialist ideology that wants to centralize power, doesn't see the state as some set of neutral institutions, but something to be captured and used for political ends, and to be used for political leverage and to exert your power. And so when we have this conversation, you must always bear in mind that that is the incumbent government's ideological worldview. It's this idea of the national democratic revolution. And so there's a fundamental unwillingness to embrace things like political devolution, voluntary disbursement of power, or federalism. And Martin van Staden, who is going to be speaking after me, he's going to be speaking more about some of the legal structures in which federalism could be implemented. I just want to speak briefly about the political context at the moment as we sit here in April 2024 on the eve of the very consequential general elections that are coming up on the 29th of May. We, as the Free Market Foundation, are a non-partisan organization. We spend a lot of time analyzing and studying policy and also the political environment, but we're non-aligned, we're an independent organization. But we have nevertheless been greatly encouraged by the developments within opposition politics. We see it as a good thing that we have an increase in political competition. There's a lot of fragmentation, and that creates a lot of churn and instability in many respects. But I think it's also part of the maturation of the political system of our democracy, and competition, I think, is a good thing. Also a good thing is the levels of collaboration that we're seeing between some of the opposition parties. The multi-party charter, I think, shows a level of political maturity and a kind of longer-term view on behalf of many political parties in the opposition. And I think if you look at regions like KwaZulu-Natal, you're seeing the DA and the IFP, for example, not contesting in the same wards in by-elections, not splitting the opposition vote, and keeping the ANC out of key wards. And so if you extrapolate that onto the provincial and perhaps even the national stage, we could see provinces like Gauteng and KZN being in play. And the polling is suggesting that at the national level at least, the ANC is likely to dip below 50%. How far below 50%, I think, is uncertain. We don't have a crystal ball at the Free Market Foundation. I don't think anyone can really predict how that's going to go. A lot of the polls, there's a margin of error. There's the fact that they are merely a snapshot in time. There's a lot of discrepancies or disparities between the polling numbers. But I think if I were a betting man, I would say definitely the ANC would be below 50%, but you never know. And how far below 50%, I think, will determine various scenarios. So you could see the ANC maybe at 48% and cobbling together some small parties like the Good Party, Patricia de Lille's party, and Al Jamaah, the kind of Islamic interest group, and forming this coalition with the rats and mice and continuing in a weakened state, but continuing for the next 5 years. You could see the ANC closer to 40% and maybe the EFF at 11 or 12%. And then that triggers something which John Steenhuisen, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, has warned could be a doomsday coalition. And he's been very clear to commit himself to the multi-party charter. He says that the MPC, the DA's role within the MPC is they're almost like the anchor tenant. They've signed that pre-electoral pact. But he's also, in the same breath, said we need to do everything possible to avoid the doomsday coalition, EFF and the ANC coming together. There's also this other dynamic of Mkhonto Wesizwe, which is a ANC breakaway, and KZN potentially also being in the mix as well. They're much more of a Zulu nationalist outfit. They're wanting to form a government with the ANC, and their condition would also be that Mr. Ramaphosa steps aside and somebody else, perhaps Paul Mashatile or Gwede Mantashe, becomes the president. But Mr. Ramaphosa might go cap in hand to the DA and say, can we form a broad coalition or a government of national unity to keep the EFF out? So that is a scenario as well. So what we're saying is, we are aware that this is potentially an option for the DA. Like I said, we're non-partisan, but we want to see the maximum amount of freedom in South Africa. And I think we have some pretty serious reservations about that scenario. Perhaps that would mean that the DA might become the junior partner in a government that ends up perpetuating the status quo, and they might get blamed for a lot of the continuation of those policies. We wouldn't have a very strong opposition without the DA fulfilling that role. But nevertheless, this is not really our decision to make. But what we are saying is that if there is some kind of broad coalition on the table, the DA needs to be making very aggressive demands for federal solutions. So what does that mean? Taking over South Africa's ports, the national port authorities and Transnet, the dysfunctionality in Cape Town's port, that port needs to be under DA rule. The establishment of a provincial police force, to deal with runaway crime. The DA should have its own energy capabilities here in the Western Cape. These are different ways of thinking about how power is applied in this province. And I think the DA has done a good job in administering the current system, but the current system is ultimately under severe stress and is failing nationally. So you can think of it almost like the Titanic, that the Titanic has struck the iceberg, it's taking on water, and here we are in the Western Cape on the top deck of the Titanic. And life is still pretty good. It's warm and calm and pleasant. There's some rumblings down below, but you're not really aware of that. And the DA is like the string quartet, insisting on playing by the rules and continuing to perform its role admirably. But you can't deny that the ship is taking on water. So what we need is a team down at the bottom of the deck patching up the holes and stopping the ship from taking on water. But I think our message is very simply that regardless of which scenario materializes, the Western Cape in particular and well-functioning municipalities here need to be taking on far more powers. And that is a necessary step. If you have a radical doomsday coalition that comes into power, that's going to be even more important. If there's a kind of a multi-party charter government, that's going to be quite chaotic, quite unstable potentially. If you look at what happened in places like Tshwane, it's very difficult to make big dramatic changes to the way that administration is governed. So going to need to be building more capacity here at the local and provincial level in this region. So we're on this roadshow. This is our penultimate stop on our way to Cape Town, where we will formally launch the campaign for Home Rule tomorrow at the Fire and Ice Hotel in downtown Cape Town. We started in Nelson Mandela Bay. We then went to Plettenberg Bay, Knysna, George, Mossel Bay, and yesterday we were in Hermanus. So we're taking this message of federalism and decentralized governance through the Western Cape, and we want to culminate with our big launch tomorrow. But I think that's a good point for me to hand over to Martin van Staden, our head of policy. He comes from a legal background. He's currently pursuing his PhD in law, and he's going to tell you about some of the legal mechanisms that governments and also civil society groups can be utilizing to acquire more power for themselves for the benefit of the people who live in this province. Over to you, Martin.
Yeah, so I don't want to bore you all with legalities, but the reason one gets into that is because when you go to kind of well-meaning, well-skilled opposition governments and you start saying, hey, listen, get the job done, you often hear, no, but we can't do that. That's Pretoria's job. Or if we really want to, that would be illegal, or some other thing about funding. So one has to establish the kind of at least high-level legal foundation to tell these people, yeah, you actually can do it, and therefore you are clean out of excuses to protect the interests of the people who put you in power. So David briefly mentioned earlier that South Africa has a federal constitution, and this always the role is like people with like, what really, like the United States, like Argentina, like Austria? Well, yes, we are a federal state. It might not play out like that in practice, but the question then becomes, what is a federation, really? Now, a federation is a government where the powers of sub-central units of government, in our case, municipalities, provinces, are entrenched in the constitution itself. What does that mean? That means that the central government cannot, at its own whim, decide to revoke the powers and the functions of those levels of government. So in France and in Chile and in the United Kingdom, for instance, all that needs to happen is that the central government needs to say, we don't like what Scotland is doing, therefore we are going to repeal the 2001 Devolution Act. Simple majority, it's gone. The Scottish Parliament is gone. The Scottish government is gone. It's over. That cannot happen in South Africa. So if Premier Alan Winde makes President Ramaphosa very angry. He cannot instruct Parliament to abolish the Western Cape provincial government. That is simply impossible. In a unitary state, that is very possible. We are a federation. Very simple. Yet, in the discourse around political decentralization, we keep hearing this term that I'm very ambivalent about, devolution. We seek devolution of policing powers. We seek the devolution of railway powers and transportation infrastructure powers. But devolution is a term that belongs within the context of the unitary state. Devolution is going to Pretoria and saying, please, President Ramaphosa, pretty please give us this power. We would like to do it. Please give us this generous gift so that we can start doing this work that you are formally responsible for. It is a method of asking. It is a method of pleading, very pathetically, unfortunately, in many cases. Whereas federation is really doing, simply saying, we are a federal state. We formally, according to even the Constitutional Court on one of its better days, subscribe to the principle of subsidiarity, this idea that a function of government must be performed at the most local level where it can be most effectively performed. That is the federal principle. That is how things ought to go in South Africa. Now, for all the good that the DA does, and it being a formally federal party, if one reads its policy documentation, and if one even looks at the Inkatha Freedom Party and so on, all federalist entities, they have perhaps an unhealthy streak of pragmatism that runs through them. And what I mean by that is DA leader John Steenhuisen about 3 or 4 months ago, I think, or maybe even more recent than that, said that in the first 100 days of a DA-led coalition government in Pretoria, banish the thought, of course, but entertain that for a moment, there will be a devolution of powers to competent governments. So that sounds nice on its face, but ultimately, what does that mean? Which governments in South Africa are competent? It's the DA government. So what Mr. Steenhuisen was saying was that there will be devolution to DA governments. The issue there is that if you don't allow subcentral units of government, be it provinces or municipalities, to fail, then you are not going to allow them to succeed. Federalism and decentralization it's not a fair weather kind of principle whereby only on good days do we allow you to do your thing, but on bad days we are going to overrule everything that you're doing. Ultimately, federalism is a mode of government that emphasizes responsibility, and that means that if the people of the Ditsabola municipality in the northwest vote for ruin, then ruin is what they must get. Ultimately, that's not great. It's definitely not great for the minority who voted otherwise. But ultimately, that is, if you want a democracy, that is the democratic outcome. And that means that if that is the will of the majority, that is what must happen. And hopefully, if the responsibility does, in fact, reside there, that municipality cannot look to Pretoria and say, well, you know, we are implementing these ruinous policies and we're really enjoying it, but we're broke now and we're bankrupt, so please bail us out, which is what's currently happening. In a federal dispensation or a system that kind of respects decentralization, that would not be possible. The answer from the federal government would be, well, no, I mean, this is a federal dispensation. You have decided to pursue this policy path and you must live with the consequences of your decisions. Like I said, that's not always going to be great for everyone, but that is how you cultivate a real sense of responsibility and in turn accountability. Currently, that responsibility is diffused all throughout all South Africa's taxpayers. So if the Ditsabola municipality makes poor decisions, everyone in the Western Cape and everyone in Johannesburg has to pay for that. So the Constitution is a federal constitution, and this is not being recognized really by even the federalists in South Africa. And the reason that is, and I alluded to that very briefly, is that the legal advisors in these parties would say, no, that would be illegal. One of the arguments, for instance, that I made late last year was after the DA complained about the Port of Cape Town, saying how mismanaged it is, and now it's costing the economy billions every day in backlogs, and we cannot get exports out, and we cannot get imports in. And I said, well, take over the port. If you think you can do it better, then by all means, go and do it better. Asking the Minister of Transport to hand over the port, you know the answer to that question. Of course, he's not going to hand over the port. They're not going to devolve authority over the port, and so on. Now, what I said was, yeah, you can't immediately go to taking over the port. You must ask for devolution. That's been done, check. You must declare an intergovernmental dispute. I'm sure that has been done to say that this is causing huge damage. So these alternative options have been exhausted. And what we're saying as part of our campaign is that opposition governments have to start communicating with the central government. And one can call this a federalist posture. This is the kind of federalism one sees in the United States, through threats and ultimatums, rather than simply through compromising and pleading. So say to the central government, okay, we've tried it the nice way. We've tried to negotiate our way into fixing the port. That's not working. The port is still backlogged. The port is still costing our local economy all this money every single day. You have until the end of next year to fix this port, or then we are going to go in, we're going to escort your staff out, put them on taxis, and they can go, and we will fix the port. Now, that is illegal. One hears immediately, you cannot do that. Now, what I've been saying is that the term the law is a very small term for a very, very big concept. It's very easy to say, well, the law says this. That's usually not as simple as one might think it is. Because for every piece of legislation that there is, or a regulation, or even a constitution that sets a given rule, the common law, and this usually legislation substitutes common law and sets it aside, and the legislation applies. But this one principle transcends all of that. And you may have heard of the term that necessity knows no law. Now, the example that I often use, and it's from our law of delict and potentially even our criminal law, is that if you're walking past some casino, maybe here in Paarl, and you see that the parents have left their child locked in the car. They told him they'll be right back, but obviously that did not come to pass. The child is dying of heat stroke in the car. You are entitled to pick up a rock, break open that car window, and save the child from the vehicle. So in those circumstances, under ideal circumstances, one would say that is a criminal offense. You've destroyed someone's property, or you could be sued, you could be arrested. But no, under these circumstances, the judge, if they are a judge that understands our law, will say that no law is broken here because the person, the Good Samaritan, acted out of necessity. There was no alternative to the so-called illegal path that they have taken. Now, this doctrine, this defense of necessity, is mostly known in our private law, in our law of delict. It could be in our criminal law, which is to be fair, an aspect of public law, but it has not been developed in our constitutional law to any notable extent quite yet. But if there is any country in the world where such a doctrine should be developed, and I think increasingly, given our lived reality in South Africa, will be and should be developed, it is South Africa, the doctrine of necessity. And I have in the booklet included the requirements necessary for successfully invoking the doctrine of necessity. So if you are the person who is going to break open the back window of that car, or say you are a municipality that has decided to seize the local port from Transnet to clear the backlog and to save the country the billions of rands that it is losing daily due to the incompetence of that national entity, you would have to prove the following. You as the defendant must show firstly that the damage that you have ostensibly caused was less severe than the harm that would have resulted if you did not take that action. That you reasonably believed that the action was necessary to prevent the very harm that was caused. Of course, you must have believed that. That there was no practical alternative to avoid the harm. Now, let me stand still at this requirement. If our local governments, if our provincial governments are to adopt this idea of just do not ask. They must be reasonable. They must exhaust all the reasonable alternatives to taking such, call it drastic action. So do ask for devolution. Do ask for the central government to do better. Declare an intergovernmental dispute. That's fine. Go through the process. But ultimately, as I think this government in this province and many municipal governments in this province have discovered, the answer is simply no from the top. Tekitele said no to the devolution of policing power. When Fikile Mbalula was Minister of Transport, he was asked to devolve Transnet powers to the province. The answer was simply no. Take a hike. That is effectively what he said. Under those circumstances, when those alternatives have been exhausted, one can say, well, all right, we've now reached this point. You have until the end of the year to fix this issue, or we will fix it ourselves. You must exhaust those practical alternatives. And then finally, of course, that you did not cause the damage or the harm that you wish to avert yourself. You cannot instigate the problem and then take drastic action, arguably illegal action, to avert further harm. You are to blame. So it is quite clear that the defense of necessity should be developed in the direction of our constitutional law to enable municipalities and provinces. And really, the Western Cape is presently the only game in town. We're all hoping that after the 29th of May, Gauteng and the KwaZulu-Natal province also become players in this game of intergovernmental relations in a more decentralized South Africa. But that is a term, necessity, that must come up far more often. Now, moving on briefly from necessity, when these conversations are had with the legal advisors of these governments, one has said, okay, that's fine. However, there is no funding. We cannot do these things that you want because we are reliant as local government and certainly as provincial government. We are almost entirely reliant on grants from the central government to do the work that we are entrusted to do. That is something that everyone in a DA municipality has certainly said to the people in their own jurisdictions who say, please solve this problem for us. Please eliminate crime in Mitchell's Plain, for instance. The answer is we don't have funding to do that. That is SAPS. SAPS has to do that. We don't have the money for it. Now, there's a lot to be sympathetic to in that argument. That is true. The Constitution does centralize fiscal relations between the various spheres of government very much. So there's only one revenue service. There's only one national revenue fund into which 95% of taxes goes. The provinces have a small scope for raising their own, levying their own taxes, but it's nothing really significant. And the municipalities have their own rate-paying bases, and they also receive money from distributing electricity on behalf of Eskom. But the provinces really are the victims here. My response to that has been that while the scope of provincial funding may be limited, the depth is arguably unlimited. And the funny experience that we've had is that since we landed in PE, where we spoke to the business community there, they said that they've, in various parts of the city, taken over security services, of course, in cooperation with the municipality, or at least with the municipality's understanding, and various other municipal services, because there's very little of that coming from the municipality, that the business community is simply doing that. And I asked, okay, so are you being paid for that? Is the municipality paying you, reimbursing you? And they just said, listen, no. We're paying it out of our pockets. We're happy to do so. There's simply no choice. That's how it's going to be. The closer we've come into the Western Cape, obviously that's in the Eastern Cape, the closer we've come into the Western Cape, the more we've heard this idea of we need to be paid for it. We need to, the business community is not as willing. Certainly in Knysna and in Plettenberg Bay, there was still a lot of appetite amongst the business community to get their hands dirty and solve the problem. But when we hit George, which is a solidly DA municipality, we heard that there is a bit of ambivalence from the business community. Well, because George is nice. Things are working in George. And the feeling there is that we don't really, as the business community, have to start capacitating our municipality to build institutions, to build the defense mechanisms necessary to the ruin that will ultimately arrive in the Western Cape if it goes poorly at the end of May or if it goes poorly in 2029. That appetite is dissipating as we get deeper and deeper into blue waters, one can say. But that is a reluctance that must be overcome because the money is there. The business community has the money to provide finances to municipalities and certainly to the province to provide certain services. I mentioned a few steps, practical steps that provincial and local governments can take in the booklet to bring about a more fully realized home rule, federal dispensation in South Africa. As I often say, we are a federation without federalism. And what I would want to see more is to pack more federalist meat onto our already federal bones. And those steps are outlined there. I'll briefly go over a few of them. The first is police. Now, I am a member of what is called the Devolution Working Group. Now, this is an institution that was established a few years ago, I think during the COVID lockdowns, by the Democratic Alliance, the Cape Independence people. I think there is the South African Agricultural Initiative is involved, AfriForum, etc., the ACDP. All broadly organizations that support federalism and decentralization. And almost from the get-go, there were 2 devolution in Dabas. I think there were 2-day events. There were hundreds of thousands of emails and WhatsApp messages and Teams calls and meetings, thousands of man-hours poured into what became a focus on the devolution of policing power. Now, we're all federalists in that group, but somehow we ended up playing this game with each other as if we didn't know that Bekitele was going to say no. We all knew Bekitele was going to say no. Of course, Bekitele was going to say no to the devolution of policing power. Yet we wasted all of this time crafting resolutions that the provincial parliament ended up adopting, insisting that there must be a devolution of policing power. Letters were sent and so on, and everyone patted each other on the backs for these well-crafted letters. Of course, Bekitele said no. About a year later, Panyaza Lesufi in Gauteng wakes up one morning, yawns, and he's like, you know, I want a provincial police service in Gauteng. Later that afternoon, they have a provincial police service in Gauteng. Wonderful. So we waste the time playing a game amongst federalists, but the centralizing Panyaza Lesufi established a police service of maybe questionable professional credentials, but nonetheless, he established it by sneezing, yet we had to play a game. So our argument now is the Western Cape can establish a Western Cape Provincial Police Service. Simple. This has been set out to the DA, to their governments. I wrote a long column for the Daily Friend about how this can be done legally. There's something in Schedule 5 of the Constitution, which is the exclusive areas of provincial legislative competence. One of the items there is provincial planning. Now, if you're a good federalist and you read that and you work in provincial government, you must obviously say that, well, it's part of my plan for the province to have a provincial police force, therefore provincial planning is the route that I'm going to go in adopting this legislation. Other things like provincial roads and traffic, etc., are also an exclusive provincial competence. These things must be interpreted broadly because South Africa is a federation. So they cannot be read as provisions in a unitary constitution, but must be read as provisions in a federal constitution. So there are mechanisms to establishing a fully fledged provincial police service in the Western Cape, complete with detectives, air support, tactical support, forensics laboratory, ballistics, all the nice things that Pretoria does not provide anymore. And this is simply, in our view, an imperative. Prosecution. Now, this is a tricky one. We have one single national prosecuting authority in South Africa. We have 86 murders, reported murders every single day in this country. We have 5 reported rapes every single hour in this country. I'm sure there's dozens more that are not reported every single hour. How is the single national prosecuting authority ever going to prosecute all of these crimes? We have a handful of high courts in this country. We have a handful of magistrates' courts. It is impossible for one institution to do this, and it is not doing it because it is, in fact, impossible. So perhaps more importantly than the decentralization of policing power is the decentralization of prosecuting authority. And we've done that. In the 1970s, we have private prosecutions in South Africa. It's not a simple thing to invoke. Private prosecutions must be done in the name of the victim of the crime. The National Prosecuting Authority must decline to prosecute. So there are various things that must be done first, but there is no reason why every municipality, why every province cannot establish its own private prosecutions unit, as AfriForum has done. The Western Cape had a private prosecuting unit for rural crimes, I believe, that it established in 2010 or 2013. The only evidence that ever existed was a press release from the Democratic Alliance. I have never seen anything else from that unit since then. So that was not taken seriously, but it is something that can be done and should be done and must be done. And then finally, there aren't just 3 steps. I have many in the booklet, but our time is running out. Finally, and perhaps most contentiously, is that our provincial and municipal governments, those that are well-governed, staffed by well-meaning politicians who understand that government's role is to protect the liberty and property of its constituents rather than destroy the liberty and property of its constituents, they must adopt a significantly more confrontational, less compromising and less conciliatory tone with the central government. We've been told on this roadshow that adopting that tone of conciliation and of let me help you to help us, and that has worked in many circumstances, and I think be strategic, of course, do what works in the circumstances, but ultimately whenever big reforms start coming down the pipeline, we know that the central government's answer is no. And at some point, no must not be taken for an answer anymore, and rather provincial governments, municipal governments must in fact start saying no. The new Expropriation Act has just been adopted. It's waiting for the president's signature. In that act, it allows the Department of Public Works to expropriate private property without paying a cent in compensation. Yet our Constitution, Section 25, still provides that upon expropriation, compensation must be paid. This is an unconstitutional piece of legislation. There's various academics around the country who think that they have a good way of reading the Constitution, and that in fact, somewhere in it implicit, you can steal property without paying for it, but that is simply not the case. So what is going to happen? The central government might attempt to implement the Expropriation Act. It's an election year, and it might be quite desperate after this election to show that it has the radical credentials that it has always claimed it has had. It might try to expropriate property without compensation while that legislation is being challenged in court before a judgment has been rendered on its constitutionality. Our argument is that provincial and municipal governments must place whatever police authority they have between whoever is trying to steal that property and the property, and say, no, you will not take property in this province without paying compensation until this legislation's constitutionality has been decided upon. When the police minister, a civilian, goes onto the beaches of Cape Town harassing beachgoers in the sun with riot police telling them to go inside, where was the Cape Town Metro Police saying, excuse me, sir, you do not get to do this. Leave. We will deal with this as normal police in the normal course of our business, rather than this charade, this abuse of public authority that you are engaging in, Mr. Police Minister. Where were those authorities when that happened? Our argument is that the city of Cape Town it owes its allegiance to its own people. They were put in power by the people of Cape Town, not by the central government, and they owe a duty of protection, of interposition, of nullification, They are the lesser magistrate, as Christian doctrine would say, for the people of Cape Town. They are the protector, and so is the Western Cape provincial government. So it might seem like a step away from legality, but it isn't. It is a more fuller embrace of what the law ultimately does mean, and this will lead into a lot of litigation, and I'm sure it will. But the great federations of the world, Canada, the United States, Australia, these were all forged in the courtrooms, and South Africa's federalist litigation has fallen off. We had a little bit of it in the late 90s and nothing since then. We think it's time to pick up the mantle and start the fight for federalism once again. Thank you for your time.